Welcome once again to EBNet Stream. The retirement industry in South Africa is substantial, with assets totaling around 50% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Although this positions it as a significant player in the financial landscape, it is smaller compared to retirement systems in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. As I explore more around sustainable and impact investing, I reached out to Jason Becker, the head of client solutions at Sasfin Asset Consulting, who has spent a fair amount of time as head of defined contribution investment consulting at a large pension consultancy in the UK, hoping that he could share some of his learnings with me. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Lovely, lovely. Let's get into it. I appreciate the retirement framework in any country is complex, and we can't unpack everything in today's conversation. But what, in your opinion, are the biggest trends you've experienced in your time in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So that's right. I've spent quite a bit of time previously in the UK as head of defined contribution investment consulting at a large pension consultancy in London. I certainly didn't go there for the weather, and I must say it's really nice to be back in sunny South Africa. So yeah, my background is in investment consulting, having headed up the investment consulting business at Sasfin for the last 17 years. I've always had a keen interest in global pension systems, and I've been studying them for a number of years. So I decided the only way to really gain real experience is to actually go there and see what's going on. So I moved over to the UK, and I must say it's a pension industry which is in a very exciting place. If we look at South Africa, the default is defined contribution, which differs from the UK as they're now starting to move from defined benefit to defined contribution. It's quite interesting that many years ago, South Africa moved from defined benefit to defined contribution, but the UK is only starting to see this trend now. I was also really surprised at the number of similarities between the South African and the UK pension industry. And in fact, in some ways, we are actually ahead in terms of our thinking. So there are really four main themes I want to focus on in terms of what's happening in the UK pension industry. It's an industry that's constantly evolving. It's almost impossible to keep up with the regulatory changes as they're literally changing on a weekly basis as they gear up for the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution. There's so much information going around that, trying to keep up with this is almost like a full-time job because the regulations are changing at such a rate of knots. I actually did a keynote address at a conference in London where I spoke about global pension systems. And what was interesting is that Europe actually has one of the most advanced pension systems in the world. Countries like, if you can believe it, Iceland, Denmark, and Amsterdam are actually leading the way in terms of the global pension industry. Amsterdam has been leagues ahead for some time now, and I'll explain that in more detail as we go along. So let's focus on the first theme. In the UK at the moment, the big focus is on value for members. So it's really all about the members at the end of the day and how we can improve their ultimate experience and outcome at retirement. This ties in primarily with investment strategy and looking for new ways to innovate and improve member outcomes at retirement. So there's a big focus on the moment in private markets. And I'm really pleased to see that South Africa is also moving towards this trend. There's been some recent discussions around how we can incorporate private markets in a funds investment strategy to improve performance as well as diversification. So how can these assets enhance your overall investment strategy? Historically in the UK, investment performance has been lagging some of the other global pension schemes, especially the likes of the US. So in the UK, in June last year, the Minister of Pensions actually came out to say that we need to be considering other alternatives in terms of improving member performance as we have been lagging behind some of our counterparts like the US. So this has become a really big focal point with a number of new private markets launching to accommodate this. The reason it's become such a big focal point is that private markets based on various different research has the potential to improve risk-adjusted returns significantly. In addition to private markets, and I'll touch on that in more detail in a moment, another focus has been on decumulation. So decumulation, we refer to this in South Africa as a cradle-to-grave type strategy, where we're focusing more on the member's experience post-retirement, not just on pre-retirement. Generally, what we want to do is link the member's investment strategy pre-retirement to their post-retirement requirements. And in order to do that, we need to come up with different options depending on what the member will decide to eventually take at retirement, including, for example, an annuity, a drawdown option, or a cash lump sum. Each of these options need their own investment strategy. So decumulation is something that they're really focusing on the moment to make sure that whatever the member decides to select in the years in retirement, that they have a matching investment strategy that will complement this. Then, in addition, so looking at the next point, CDC, or collective defined contribution. So this might be quite new to some of the audience in terms of what is CDC and collective defined contribution. It's become a very big focal point in the UK. And the reason for that is that the first CDC fund has actually gone live. It went live in September 2024. And this is for the Royal Mail Pension Fund, which is one of the largest pension funds in the UK, which has approximately 100,000 members. So what is CDC? CDC is basically a new type of pension structure which targets a benefit at retirement. So it's not guaranteed like a defined benefit scheme, but rather targets a pension at retirement and beyond. Both the employer and employee contribute a fixed percentage. However, due to the collective nature of such scheme, both longevity and investment risk is pooled among members and employers. Research has shown that CDC can add an additional 30% to a member's final net replacement rate at retirement. So in South Africa, generally, you're looking at a replacement rate of around 75%. So that means that you would want to replace around 75% of your final salary as a pension payment in retirement. CDC has now shown they can add an additional 30% to members' final net replacement rate at retirement. So we cannot ignore this type of structure. However, as with everything, these schemes come with their complexities, and if implemented, will require a number of changes. Firstly, regulations will need to be amended to allow for such schemes. And there will also need to be a change in the design of administration capabilities of the big administrators to accommodate such type of scheme, and also a big drive in terms of employer and employee education around CDC, as it really is complex and difficult to understand. Right, my last point on my learnings in the UK, and then perhaps we can move on, is ESG. So ESG, as we all know, environment, social and governance, and impact investing. How do we comply with ESG requirements? So it's quite interesting to see, especially in the UK and Europe, that most assets are actually now starting to move to ESG type strategies, which focus on impact investment and alignment with the Paris Accord. So the Paris Accord was a resolution a number of years ago where they are targeting, on the back of climate change, a net zero gas emissions by 2050. So there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that we get to that point in the next number of years. So this has basically seen a huge growth in ESG type investing. What is impact investing? So impact investing is basically an investment strategy that targets companies or industries that produce social environmental benefits. This includes investing in the likes of wind farms, forestry, water, and even solar energy. In South Africa, we're also focusing on these type of investments, but it's taking longer to implement due to the availability of such investments. I do believe that ESG will become more of a focus area as the pension industry evolves. Please note, this is not to say that we're not doing anything in ESG. In fact, there's a number of asset managers out there that are really running some very innovative and interesting ESG type strategies. And I think we'll see more of this come to the fore in South Africa, because it certainly has become very popular in Europe and the UK, and we can definitely learn something from that. Thanks, Natalie. So that's basically the 4 main lessons that I learned in my travels in the UK.
Thank you for sharing those. And I'm glad you mentioned both private markets and ESG, because I'd like to hone in a little bit more on that, and some of the questions that I myself have got. In a country like ours that is so desperately in need of rebuilding through infrastructure investment and looking for, you've already mentioned, alternative energy sources, why does it feel like we're taking so long to implement these types of investments?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think to answer that question, we need to look at private markets in more detail. It is something that's relatively new in South Africa, especially in the defined contribution space. So the interesting thing with private markets is they've actually been around for a number of years, but in the defined benefit space, where your liabilities are generally longer term in nature. So if we look at private markets, what does it include? So private equity is obviously a big focus point at the moment. And private equity in this space, in the context of private markets, basically targets high growth companies in different industries like fintech, health tech, biodiversity, life sciences, and clean technology. So it also includes the likes, private markets. So in addition to private equity, it also includes the likes of venture capital, real estate, infrastructure, and private debt. Now in South Africa, we've been allocating to real estate for a number of years. The interesting point in South Africa, and based on the changes to Regulation 28 that happened a few years ago of the Pension Funds Act. So just to give you context, Regulation 28 basically sets the limits to which a pension fund can invest in different asset classes. And managers and investment consultants need to be cognizant of that and make sure that the pension fund is Regulation 28 compliant. So for example, there's limits on equity, there's limits on property, and so on. And now what they've come out with, which I think is very, revolutionary and really forward thinking, is that you can now invest as much as 10% in private equity and 45% in infrastructure. So this changes the whole landscape. Going back 60, 70 years with Markowitz and Sharp in terms of the Nobel Peace Prize, where they basically came out with modern portfolio theory, which showed that if you invested 60% in equities and 40% in bonds, you would have got a far better return than having a more diversified type of portfolio. And it did hold true until a few years back, where things have now changed. So what the regulator is looking to do is basically to see how we can allocate to different types of innovative investment strategies, including the likes of private equity and infrastructure. So we have no excuse in South Africa not to be allocating to these asset classes. However, why has there been such a slow uptake of these types of assets in South Africa? And the simple reason is that we have limited opportunities to invest in these type of strategies at the moment. If I look at globally, there's far more opportunities, especially in the infrastructure and private equity space, that they can make investments into. A lot of the private equity will see global private equity type strategies being implemented. But what about South Africa? What's happening in the local private equity and infrastructure space? We have to be looking at ways of allocating to these types of investments locally as well, not just offshore. So private markets is relatively new theme in the defined contribution space, as I mentioned, and there's quite a lot of difficulties around implementing these types of strategies. One of the biggest difficulties is actually around liquidity. As you know, different to a defined benefit fund, in the defined contribution space, members are coming off the fund, retiring off the fund on an ongoing basis. And therefore, we have to make sure that we have enough liquidity to meet these types of liabilities and payments as and when they fall due. So the only way to really do that is to carve out an allocation to a cash type investment in the private market solution to be able to implement a cash management type of tool or mechanism to meet the cash flows of a defined contribution fund. Now, the problem with that is that means most managers in the private market space generally have as much as 20 to 30% in a cash management type solution, which means you only have a maximum of 70% that are actually being exposed, that has exposure to private markets. So quite interestingly, a lot of private market funds have been launched. In the UK especially, they've now implemented what they refer to as an innovation sleeve, which basically includes a number of different innovative type of investment strategies, especially in the global equity space, but also includes private markets. So the interesting thing, although there's this massive drive to implement private markets in the UK and Europe, we're generally only seeing allocations of 2-3%. And why is that? Because generally private markets are very expensive. So no one wants to run towards this and be the most expensive investment manager out there. So they're very cognizant of costs, but that certainly does come it certainly does come at the expense of the member in terms of only focusing on costs and not focusing on the potential for higher return by allocating to private markets. So although there is a big drive in private markets, we're not seeing much allocation in UK and even in Europe. So private markets also has the benefit of ESG integration. And I think, Natalie, we're going to come on to that point in a moment. As these type of companies you're looking to invest in, as I mentioned, for example, if you take the clean technology space, that's having a major impact on the environment in the UK. So private markets really do come with an extra ESG integration, which has become so important in terms of investment strategies. Then in addition to private equity, if we just take a look at private debt, so for example, private debt, also known as private credit, really refers to loans to companies which are not provided by banks or public markets, and instead are provided by private markets. As private credit is not traded or issued on the open public market, investments are not always readily realizable, and private debt generally comes with the advantages of higher returns, diversification, and lower risk. So it's not just the case of looking at private equity type returns, but we can also do some very good things in the private debt space. So moving away from private markets for a moment, we also need to consider innovating in other areas, especially in the global equity space. I just referred now to innovative global equity type of companies and how we can bring that into the overall investment strategy for a pension fund. So innovation is becoming very popular amongst investors. When I talk about innovation, it might sound very far-fetched, but we're looking at companies involved in artificial intelligence and robotics, for example. So companies like Nvidia, Tesla, Arista, companies that produce lithium batteries, health and fintech, and even gaming companies. I know from personal experience how much time my kids spend on gaming, and this has become a massive industry. So in addition to the private markets from an innovation point of view, we are also looking at other type of companies that specialize in these type of artificial intelligence and robotics that can certainly add additional return to members as part of their investment strategies. However, you must note that these type of companies are generally higher risk. So we need to be cognizant of that, but you certainly can't ignore the return profile of these type of companies. So I certainly wouldn't bet the house, but I would look at including an innovation sleeve that does include some of private markets and these type of investments.
Thank you. So you've spoken a lot about a lot of things, and the one thing that is interesting to me is, I still feel we're so far behind, and I kind of listened to your comments around the UK being and Europe particularly being so far advanced in these type of investments. What have they done, or how have they done it to get it right?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, they've had such a focus on this type of investment allocation, and they've basically allocated billions to these types of investments and growing these types of target, new companies in these industries. So obviously a lot of it is spend in terms of allocating and deploying that capital to these high growth companies, as I mentioned. And they also allow for a look-through principle. So at any given time, an investor can see exactly what they invested in. Some of these investments generally have historically been opaque. And from a look-through principle, once investors can see exactly what they invested in, they feel more comfortable in terms of these type of investments. In South Africa, unfortunately, at the moment, and this is certainly not going to be forever, but we have very few of these types of companies and new projects that we can invest in, especially in some of the high growth industries that I mentioned previously. However, I do believe with the Government for National Unity and everything that's happening going forward, I do believe that there'll be more spend, especially on the likes of infrastructure projects and other exciting projects, will enable the South African pension industry to start allocating to these types of investments. We'll also have to follow suit in terms of the look-through principle, as everything will obviously have to be disclosed, and we'll have to understand exactly what these types of opportunities and return profile entails. But I certainly do believe that more money will be allocated to this in South Africa, and be in for a very, very exciting time in terms of some of these projects that should be launched in the future.
It's great for me that you mentioned this look-through principle, because I was actually sitting in a management committee meeting earlier this week, and I said to our advisor, I asked him what the impact investments were of my personal retirement savings. So what impact investments were we investing in? He kind of looked at me quite shocked and answered, honestly, I don't know. So what is the role of advisors here?
Yeah, I'm quite certain that's not the only advisor that answered "I don't know" to these types of questions, because it's become very complex. The role of the advisor has become very complex. Previously there were less regulations around this, and now, for example, that ESG has become so important, every advisor has to ensure that their portfolio is at least ESG compliant. We're not going to go into, the full impact investing by investing in, water and forestry and so on, but at least the minimum requirements of environmental, social, and governance. So there's many ways to do this. What we're seeing in the industry is that a lot of pension funds and asset managers are working with rating agencies, some of the larger rating agencies globally, and they generally go through your full portfolio to ensure that you're ESG compliant. And they provide you with a 100 or 150 page report, breaking everything down, and then they give you a rating based on your ESG compliance. So some funds and some pension funds, especially out there, are more ESG compliant than others, and some have a lot of work to do in terms of ensuring that they can comply with these type of strategies. So ESG is not a nice to have; it's actually a must have at the moment. And we did an interesting survey in the UK with a few hundred members where we asked them, if we can give you similar returns by investing in funds and companies that contribute to the betterment of the environment, would you go with that? And everyone turned around and said, well, why wouldn't we go with that? If we can make a difference in the environment and in the social and governance space, why wouldn't we go with that if we're going to, achieve similar type of returns? So that is now going to be the new big thing. It already is massive in Europe, but it is now going to be more of a focal point in South Africa. And that's not to say we're doing nothing in this space. We are doing some very good things, but this is going to become more prominent as we go forward. Just one last thing I wanted to mention on this point is that some of the investment platforms, especially in the UK, have actually designed member-friendly communication around ESG strategies. So they can actually show you, how much did you contribute towards, net carbon emissions and the likes of that? How many electric vehicles did you build? And, so it really is a nice way for members to look at this and actually understand it in a language that they can understand, in terms of the impact that they're actually making on the environment as well as along ESG strategies. And then, just lastly, I just wanted to say, that the pension industry in South Africa is definitely poised to implement this type of innovation that I've discussed, which will ultimately improve member outcomes at retirement. As I mentioned at the start of this discussion, that I couldn't believe when I arrived in the UK at the striking similarities between the two pension industries, and how proud I was that in certain respects we're actually more advanced than the UK and Europe. And that just goes to show how right we've got this pension industry, the great job that the regulator's doing, and now we obviously also the influence from the government, and to hopefully deploy more capital, we can create new opportunities for investors to invest in.
I'm going to spring a surprise question on you, if you don't mind.
Please.
You mentioned the opportunity or the possibility in the UK of being able to drill down at or to members in the funds and say to them, this is what you contributed to. You mentioned the building of EVs or or less carbon emissions, etc., etc. How far are we away from that in South Africa?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and obviously that probably deserves a whole discussion on its own. So I'm not going to go into member communication, but I've certainly had my fair experience with this. So the big drive from the regulator there, they've basically come out to say that no one's doing enough in terms of member education and member understanding. You're coming out with all these incredible, innovative investment strategies and structures like CDC, collective defined contribution, but do members actually understand what's going on? So this is not unique to the UK or South Africa. This is a problem across the globe in terms of member education and reporting. And I don't think anyone's really got it right. But I think as we go along, there's going to be more capital deployed to member education and upgrading systems to provide the type of communication and reporting that a member requires to make more informed decisions around their retirement. But, this is not unique to, as I said, the UK or South Africa, but we certainly need to be doing more from a member education and reporting point of view. And that's why, especially in the UK, we've seen millions of pounds being allocated to upgrading systems, administration systems, investment platform systems, and so on, to actually provide automated reporting to members, but also to include, as I mentioned, a member-friendly report on ESG, for example, that a member can actually go through it and start getting excited in terms of, wow, look how my money contributed to the overall environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jason, for taking that surprise question. I think I'll wrap up by saying that despite us being well developed, which we acknowledge and we are proud of our South African industry, there is clearly a lot we can still learn from our overseas counterparts on issues relating to the implementation of alternate asset classes, impact and ESG investing, and value for money. And I think we'll have a follow-up conversation around that point in particular. But I think as decision makers and influencers, we need to start pushing for progress in this area because we certainly are the custodians of a significant amount of assets that could really make a difference. And so I think trustees do need to start asking the questions that perhaps make their advisors feel a little bit uncomfortable. So thank you, Jason, for exploring this with me.
Thank you, Natalie. I really enjoyed our discussion. Thanks for having me again.
Lovely. Thank you. Keep well.
You too.